Hi, all. Welcome back to Environmental Science 101. And this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about ecology. Um, it's important to know ecological concepts when you're studying environmental science because most of the premises in environmental science, or I guess the baseline parts of science, are directly related to ecology, or how organisms interact with their environment. And so maybe recently you probably heard quite a bit about monarch butterflies, their populations, and how climate change is affecting their populations. But what we often don't talk about is, what about the species that are directly related to the monarch butterfly? What about the species that need monarch butterflies to be prevalent in order for them to survive? Okay, so let's take this butterfly down here. It looks a lot like the monarch butterfly on purpose. Okay, this is called Batesian mimicry. Okay, this is the viscera butterfly. And so they look very, very similar to monarch butterflies. And they've evolved for thousands, maybe millions of years, probably millions of years, to mimic the same pattern or similar pattern as monarch butterflies. And the question is, why? Well, scientists have gone out and they know why. Monarch butterflies, they lay their caterpillar on milkweed. That caterpillar will consume the milkweed, and they sequester the toxins in the milkweed, and that makes monarch butterflies poisonous. Well, viscera butterflies are not. Okay? They lay their eggs and have caterpillars on completely different plants. But because their color pattern looks like monarch butterflies, then birds and other organisms that might be eating butterflies will react to viscera butterflies as if they're a monarch, and they won't eat them. Now, let's think about a world where there are no monarchs. It doesn't take long for the viscera butterfly to disappear too, or for the viscera butterfly to then have their populations decline, because once birds find out that this butterfly is not a monarch butterfly, and they don't taste bad, and they're not toxic, then the bird will be feeding its offspring viscera butterflies. Its offspring will have the search image of a viscera butterfly and will eat viscera butterflies. And now the population, which was adapted in this form to be in regions where there's monarch butterflies, no longer have the monarch to mimic. Okay? And so this is kind of the environmental science ecology connection. When species are removed or altered, we often think, okay, yeah, so we lost a butterfly. Big whoop, right? It's a butterfly. What good is it to us? Well, it can have drastic ecological effects. It can affect other species of butterfly. It can affect the plants that the offspring are consuming. So now, instead of having, a control on milkweed, now you have much more milkweed potentially in an environment if there are no monarch butterflies. And so currently that's one of the reasons why there's very few monarch butterflies, is because there's not enough food. But other issues will happen if a species goes extinct or is removed from a population. Okay, so let's dive into kind of some definitions, simple definitions. What is ecology? Okay, I already kind of mentioned this. Ecology is the study of how organisms interact with their environment. And this is like key to environmental science. Like, environmental scientists are ecologists, and most ecologists are environmental scientists. Okay, they study how the environment and organisms interact. The difference with environmental science is that often environmental scientists have a sociology, psychology, political, economical slant to a lot of their questions. Like, how do we make policies around this? How does society benefit from this? How do we make rules and regulations around this? And that's a lot of times with environmental science. They're thinking about more of the protection. Ecologist is thinking about just figuring out the interactions, figuring out the science behind it, not how humans fit in to that. But the two often go hand in hand. Okay? And so we'll also look at some other concepts in ecology, like studying distribution of organisms, studying population increases, decreases, studying the cohorts or the age distribution of populations. There's a lot of things that go into ecology. We've already talked about some of them with things like keystone species, things like cascades or food webs, pyramids. These all fall under the title or the category of ecology. Okay. So how is ecology or ecological systems organized? Normally we organize systems in the following. We're often not interested in single organisms. Okay? Maybe we're sampling single organisms, but we're often interested in populations. Okay, so that's kind of the first level of organization. The same species, the same organism that live together are members of the population. And normally a population is defined by organisms that can reproduce together. Okay, so you might have a population of bats. That indicates, if I'm saying I study a population of bats, it indicates a single species, and that population would have individuals that can mate, reproduce, and pass their genetics on to the next generation. That's a population. A species would consist of all those organisms, all those populations. Okay? In some cases, like if you're looking at humans, and we've talked about this before in class, the population of humans on this planet, or how many individual species are there on this planet of Homo sapien, is about 8.2 billion. Right? Now you could divide those into populations. You could say, people in this region are one population, and this region are another population. But because of air travel and our ability to really reach all places on the planet that people inhabit, then we consider the entire planet, these two are the same, basically. When we count, it's the same number for how many human species are there, and then how many human populations are there. There's one population because the two are the same. But normally these aren't the same for other organisms because they don't have the ability to commute as far. So like we've talked a little bit about, Owen's pupfish and Phil Peaster and his work with saving a species. Okay, so there's like 4 locations where this species occurs, and those are the 4 populations. So add them all together, and that's how many organisms you have of that Owen's pupfish for that species. Okay. Communities are a little bit different. So there's things that we normally call biological communities or ecological communities, and then communities that other groups of academics would suggest, and maybe social sciences or psychology or even history, and they are called social communities, or they have a different definition. Biological communities mean all the different species that occur in a given area. Okay, every species. We're talking bacteria, archaea, protists, fungi, plant, animal, right? All that consist in a community. Social communities we're normally just talking about humans. Okay? And so those two kind of definitions are very different from each other. Okay? So normally when we're talking about ecological communities, we're talking about all the organisms, all the species that occur in a given environment. All right? Ecosystem. An ecosystem is normally similar to a community. Okay, it's a given region, but now we're not just talking about the living things. We're also talking about the non-living things. So typically when ecologists talk about this, we talk about abiotic, okay, a meaning non, biotic life, so non-living, so this is things like temperature, salinity, pH, precipitation, wind speed, these kind of things, the cycles that we talked about, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, all these cycles have to do with abiotic features. Now, they might have a direct link to biotic features, okay, like nitrogen-fixing bacteria or nitrogen-fixing fungi, okay, or organisms that can break down carbon and restore it or change it to a useful structure, organisms like trees that can hold on to carbon. Okay, they all have their role, but if it's a living organism, we typically call it a biotic factor. So non-living is abiotic, living is biotic. Okay? And so an ecosystem is both those pieces, the biotic factors, so all the organisms that live in a given environment, and abiotic, all the features, the physical features that might affect those organisms. Okay. Then you have biomes, which are just much larger regions, and normally we will denote what type of biome it is by putting in front of it terrestrial biomes. So if it's a terrestrial biome, we're talking about a region, the plants, the animals, the microorganisms, all the abiotic features that occur in a distinct region. Okay? This is similar to an ecosystem, except for normally it's at a larger span. It's a larger area. Okay? And then, of course, if we're talking about aquatic biomes, we normally would denote it as the marine biome or freshwater biome, something like that, where we're talking about a region, maybe in a marine environment. We're talking about, the Arctic Sea or the Arctic Ocean, and we're talking about the biome that occurs in the Arctic, in that marine habitat. Okay, so that, normally we would denote it by what kind of environment it is. Is it marine? Is it freshwater? Is it terrestrial? And then the last one, which there is only one, and that's the biosphere. Okay, so all the world's biomes, marine, freshwater, everything, terrestrial, all the biomes fit together into a single biosphere. Okay? And that's really the 6 levels of ecological organization, all of which scientists study pieces of it. Sometimes, when it comes to a population, a scientist can study the entire population. Even communities, they can study the entire community or close to it. But as you increase in complexity, less of the level is studied directly. So like the biosphere, we might study temperature profiles of the biosphere, or wind speeds of the biosphere, or precipitation patterns of the biosphere. But we're not studying all the microorganisms on the biosphere, on the planet. Okay. So just to kind of give you an example of, just to make sure that we're on the same page. The other thing about community, when we talk about communities, often the dominant organism, or sometimes the keystone species, is named, like denotes the name of that community. For example, like if you go to northern California, southern Oregon, you'll get into a region where we call it the redwood community. And so that's dominated by redwoods, okay? A species of sequoia or cedar tree that grows extremely large, has extreme age to it, and they're the dominant organisms in this ecosystem, in this community. And we know this, if you remove all the redwoods from the redwood community, the community will change. It will alter the other organisms, living around it. Now, that being said, the community itself is not just the redwoods. We would talk about the ferns, the flowering plants, the angiosperms. We might talk about the invertebrates, like these darkling beetles. There's lots of other organisms that react and interact within this community. Okay, but remember, the community is not talking about the abiotic factors. When we get to that, we'd have to say the redwood ecosystem, and then we start talking about, well, how much rain or how much moisture does this get? What's the temperature profile? How much wind speed? Where's the moisture coming from? All these other factors. What's the carbon cycle like? Nitrogen cycle like? These kind of things that would encounter that. Okay. All right, and of course we've talked about this before a little bit in different avenues, and when we were talking about and taking samples on the marine ecosystem that we do on campus, we often talking about okay, temperature profile might determine what macro invertebrates are around, what types of marine invertebrates you collect in a phytoplankton sample, or what marine invertebrates you might collect in a benthic sample. So normally the climate or the abiotic features will determine what organisms can live in a given region. All right, so some things to really typically include in environmental science and environmental studies, most often these are kind of the 4 points that will drive where organisms are at. Temperature is probably number 1. Right? What's the temperature profile? Are the organisms established, and can they live in a region where temperatures get extremely cold? Then really, and I mean, all of these are linked together. Clearly sunlight links back to temperature, water will link to soil, sunlight will also link to soil, temperature links to soil. So all these are really intertwined and linked together. Temperature links to water, but the other components are water. Is there enough water to carry out the life cycle of the organism? Do they have adaptations for water that comes abundantly? Are there organisms that live in water, or organisms that are constantly wet? Do they have some kind of adaptation? What about organisms that live in arid environments where water is limited or only comes once or twice in a year? Can they store water? Or can they live long periods without water? Sunlight, same kind of situation. We talked about photosynthesis. This is a huge deal for photosynthesis. Okay, is there enough sunlight to carry out your life cycle if you're a plant? Or do you have to develop giant leaves to soak up enough sunlight to outcompete organisms around you? Or are you really small and the little bit of sunlight that you get is enough to grow, reproduce, but you don't live very long? Okay. Soil, same kind of thing. Soil, though, plays back into the cycles we talked about: the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, these water cycle included. Okay, these are big players in the soil, which, often we talk about from a biological perspective. We talk about plants dictate herbivores. So what plant community you have there tells you what kind of herbivore community you're going to have there, the things that eat the plants. Okay? But soil and sunlight and water and temperature dictate what kind of plant community you're going to have. Okay, so it's these abiotic features that tell you what kind of plant community you're going to have, which then tells you what kind of herbivore community you're going to have, which then tells you what kind of primary carnivore you're going to have, and on and on and on. Okay? So real quick, I just want to end, we often will look at adaptations for organisms that occur in different regions. So, for example, like a wolf that occurs in Northern America, and is well suited for changing environments. It changes its coat color depending on the season. Okay, this is related to genetics. This is temperature determinant genes that turn off and on when the temperatures differ, and that's how coat color changes. Okay, but they have adaptations in blood vessels that allow them to stand in snow, stand in freezing weather, that diverts blood, and it basically allows their feet to come close to freezing. Okay, and keeps their body temperature, their core body temperature, warm. Then if you look at something like an iguana, a green iguana is well suited for an environment that's close to the equator. They're not well suited for an environment that's freezing. Okay, they can't tolerate it. Their bodies, they're ectotherms, so they absorb whatever temperature it is around them, and that's how they move around and determine their body temperature. Okay? But in the tropics, where you might have a huge amount of green foliage, it pays, at least for these organisms, while they're warming up, while they're getting enough energy from the sun to move throughout the landscape, for them to be camouflaged. And so they often will have this green color to match the color of their environment. They also, it's not really seen very well in this picture, but they also have black bands. So there's this iguana behind it has black band on its tail. Same thing with this one. You just can't see it. And they have black bands by their legs. Black and color, vertical patterns in color will often indicate shadows, and so it breaks up, or it looks like a shadow. So when you look at the organism, it looks like, okay, well, maybe this part of the organism looks like something alive, but then you get this shadow, so it looks like it doesn't have a second half of the organism. Okay, and that's what those vertical patterns typically do in forest environments because of the trees. And so you can see in the background, these trees are vertical, so they'll often have vertical lines. This is adaptations to an environment, and really dictates where these organisms are going to get established. Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about population range and population dynamics.